Hello and welcome to episode 87 of the Virtual Velo Podcast, the show that bridges the gap between athlete and avatar, keeping it real in the world of cycling esports. So happy to bring a virtual cycling feel-good story today, one that reminds us that even as elite sport grows more complex, the grassroots still show us why we fell in love with virtual cycling in the first place. Our guests are making an impact that is authentic and real. Joining us are two members of Team Africa Rising, an organization working on the ground across the African continent and launching an initiative to get 1,000 young cyclists racing online. And as we like to do when this topic comes up, we've brought in a native South African to help guide the conversation. My friend and award-winning cycling journalist, Aaron Burrell. Thanks so much for sitting in for Emma, Aaron.
Thanks, Chris. It's always good to be on the show. I think this is my fourth or fifth time, and hoping to bring some meaningful conversation to this one.
So before we introduce our guests, why don't you tell me about your exciting new role in the industry and how that's brought you back to the continent recently?
Yeah, so a few months ago, I decided to go freelance as a cycling journalist, and it was going really, really well. And I was doing a lot of work for various publications. And I'd say after Tour de France, I was offered a role at Cycling Weekly, which I took, which I was very excited about. And also entered a gravel stage race in South Africa, a really hard one called Gravel Burn. And I raced that as a journalist and a rider, which was pretty difficult to balance everything I had to do as a journalist and then obviously as a racer too, but got some really great stories out of that, some good content and a lot of memory. Can't say all of them were good because the terrain and the temperatures and the weather were so brutal, but happy to be back in the UK. Granted, it's pretty cold at the moment.
Yeah, it looked like an amazing event. Of course, the founder of Escape Collective, Wade Wallace, who obviously that's who I'm writing for now, he was there. He was documenting, and it looked like a pretty huge undertaking, and it would have been much nicer if the weather cooperated, but certainly like it was really great. Joining Aaron and me on the Virtual Velo Podcast is the CEO of Team Africa Rising, Kimberly Coates. In addition to being one of the only women in African cycling, she has been recognized as one of Cyclists magazine's most influential women in cycling and Escape Collective's 50 most influential Americans in cycling, to name a few. The list is quite long, actually. With her is Jeremy Ford, a media spokesperson for the organization. Wonderful to have you both here to introduce this initiative.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's begin by having you share some background about yourselves and how that has set the stage for your current roles with Team Africa Rising. Why don't we begin with you, Kimberly?
Well, I kind of ended up doing this by accident. I was working in Las Vegas and I read an article about Team Rwanda back in 2008. And it was written by Jason Gay, an incredible journalist, Outside Magazine at the time. And I just thought to myself, I need to go to Rwanda. Had no idea where Rwanda was. Long story short, I went there for 3 months and I stayed for 8 years. And along with my partner, we developed the national cycling team of Rwanda. So I always tell people I just kind of made up my job. And that's why I'm here today, 16 years later, still madly passionate about helping kids and developing African cyclists and getting them onto the world stage.
Yeah, that's a great story. And you, Jeremy, how did you get involved with Team Africa Rising?
Yeah, it's about 10 years ago. I was in Kenya. I used to be a mountain bike racer, and I was in Kenya doing a charity ride up or around Mount Kenya with a Kenyan athlete who told me that I asked him, how do I help you become a pro cyclist? And he said, unfortunately, Kenyan cycling is a little bit tricky, but told me there were these two Americans in Rwanda doing some big things. And I think I emailed Kim about 4 times because I worked in the law industry for 25 years as sort of head of marketing communications. And I was on the moment where I could take a 6-month sabbatical, and I emailed Kim saying, can I come and help? And she ignored me, I think, 3 times. And then finally she said, okay, if you come, you're here to work, not go and see the gorillas. So I turned up for a month. I think it ended up being 2 months. Never saw the gorillas. And it all started from there. We've been doing Africa Rising ever since.
Can you share the story of Team Africa Rising? What inspired you and what problems you're trying to solve and voids you're trying to fill?
Team Africa Rising evolved out of what we did in Rwanda. So we started in Rwanda. Jack Boyer started there in 2006, went to a local race with Tom Ritchie. And they just saw some talent. And Jock went back in 2007, and I came along in 2009. I was actually working mostly for Tom Ritchie's cargo bike project, and I just fell in love with the team and I wanted to help. So we decided to spin off from Tom's project and formed our own nonprofit, Team Rwanda Cycling, which then became Team Africa Rising, because what we found was that it was so much bigger than Rwanda. Yes, we were doing great things in Rwanda, and Rwanda was moving quickly up the ranks, but there was so many other kids. We worked in Ethiopia for a little bit. We've gone to Eritrea. Everybody just started reaching out because they saw Rwanda, a country that had zero presence on the Africa tour, all of a sudden show up and steadily moving up the ranks. And everybody wanted to know what we were doing. And it really wasn't anything special except for focusing on it, providing the conduit for parts and supplies, for equipment, for training. And it just came together. And then over the years, because we were working with so many other countries, we became Team Africa Rising just simply because it was bigger than Rwanda. And we've been working as such since 2011-12.
I'm going to direct this towards you, Jeremy, because you had a prior career. You had a law career. You're taking a sabbatical. You tell us that you tried really hard to get the attention. What is it about the cycling, the people, the place that makes you so passionate about trying to promote it there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't know about the law industry, because lawyers get a lot of bad rap in the world, but in American firms, there's a big focus on pro bono work. So lawyers doing things for free, whether it's immigration or things like this. So I was attracted to doing pro bono work in marketing communications. I'd always been in cycling, in mountain biking mainly. I met some African cyclists and saw the talent. I mean, we were going up Mount Kenya, and there were 6 of us on, $10,000 bikes. And this guy was unclipping one of his SPDs and going past us one leg just to take the mickey, and was 10 years older than all of us. So you had that moment of talent, and it's what Kim always talks about of when they saw Adrian Leon-Schutte, like they just thought this guy's got talent, and we were all people from cycling. What really got me is that I'd been in the world of cycling up till the age of sort of 23, 24 when I went into the city. And I hadn't really stayed within the world of cycling. And I suddenly thought, actually, there is a way to get into that. I'd done a lot of charity work in Africa before, in East Africa. So the two things sort of came together quite well. And then I started meeting the athletes, and you just get hooked because you can see the talent. And it's that classic thing of, if you've got the talent, then you can get the bikes, you can get the equipment, then you can get the races, and the world can see it. And I think I was lucky also because I started with Africa Rising in June 2015. 1 month later, Steve Cummings is putting his hand up on Mandela Day, winning a stage for Dimension Data. And Daniel Tekla-Hymanot, had the King of the Mountain jersey. So suddenly, just, within a month of me sort of being involved with it and watching it, we were all sat in the center in Mzanzi in Rwanda watching the Tour de France, seeing, a black Eritrean celebrating getting King of the Mountain jersey, and just seeing the kids reacting. They were Rwandan kids, but that didn't matter, right? They reacted in a way I've not seen before, and it gets under your skin and doesn't really leave.
Kimberly, I've got a question for you. Looking at the beginnings and the start of Team Africa Rising, what would you say are some of the most significant milestones that have been achieved along the way?
Without a doubt, Adrian Leon-Schutte's 2012 Olympics. That was epic. He was trying to qualify in the Olympics for road. No Rwandan cyclist had ever qualified for the Olympics. They had a wild card back in 94, 96, 92, something like that, but they never qualified. And it was heartbreaking at the road championships. That was his one place to qualify, and he had a mechanical and missed the break, and because of the mechanical and didn't qualify. We knew he had a chance in mountain biking. He went back to South Africa, did the Continental Championships in South Africa, and qualified. Thanks to Douglas Ryder and the work that we put in, we just focused on our number one goal was to get him to finish that race in London. And this is all played out in our documentary, Rising from Ashes. But for me, I remember standing there in Hadley Farm and I couldn't see, like, I could see the screen, but I couldn't see the start finish. We knew it was close. We were doing the math. And when he came through that tunnel and he went on to the last lap, I still get emotional about it because, like, we made history. Adrian Niyonshuti made history. It put African cycling on the map because it had never been done before. And I still think he's the only Black African to finish an XCO mountain bike race in the Olympics to this day. And so I would say that was a huge milestone. Obviously, building out the Africa Rising Cycling Center, and even 2025, the World Championships was significant because if we had not started back in 2007 and developing that team, Rwanda had no professional cycling before we got there. So it was just all these little steps, all these milestones that just added up one after the other to get us to where we were in September of this year.
There was a really beautiful moment in Kigali at the World Championships. I was there with Doug Ryder, who was sort of off duty because it's the World Championships. So it had a beer and it was just sort of end of the season sort of thing. He just looked at me because he's known Jock and Kim since 2008, something like that.
Yeah.
Adrian joined the team, I think 2009, MTN Quebec. MTN Renegade as it was then. I think it was the first Black Africa onto the team. Doug said something like, this whole thing, and we were stood there, there must have been 2,000 fans going crazy opposite where we were stood. And Doug basically looked at me and said, if Adrian hadn't beaten Jock on that mountain bike race in 2006, none of this would have happened. Because if Jock had just won the race, because Jock wasn't, he wasn't into Africa, he'd not come to do anything in Africa, Tom had asked him to come. But the whole thing was that Adrian beat Jock in the race, and Jock was still very fit and still is now. Doug's point was, if Jock had just turned up with Tom and then won the race, like, no one would have thought, okay, there's real talent here. And the energy that kicked it all off back in, it's 20 years ago now, or 19 years ago. He said that was the moment, and this whole thing sort of predicates on Adrian growing up into that, and then Adrian becoming the first Black guy on the MTN team. Then a couple of years later, you saw Mahawi Kudus, Daniel Tekla-Hymanot, those guys coming in, Songezo Jim, and the whole thing sort of spiraled from that moment. It was, Doug's last line to me was, it's strange there's no statue here in Kigali for Adrian. And I was like, yeah, that's a good point.
It's some pretty amazing milestones, but the things that people don't see are the inner workings, the day-to-day stuff. So can you tell us about the organization structure in terms of human resource allocation, infrastructure, funding, outreach?
Because you got the infrastructure right here.
Lean and mean.
So, it's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. When we were in Rwanda, we raised money it was primarily our work in Rwanda with the national team, and we employed with riders about 30 Rwandans at one point. Now, because we work all over, we're lean and mean. What we do now today is we partner with organizations or groups or federations that we know we can trust, that are on the ground doing the work. For example, like in Uganda, we wanted for years to see something happen in Uganda, but the federation was such that was impossible. It was just, we couldn't spend the money, we couldn't spend the time because our resource allocation, it would have been sucked up in corruption. And so now we work with Masaka Cycling Club, which has been huge. The leaders on the virtual platform, they were our inspiration. We work in Benin because the Benin Federation president is legit and we can get things done. We can move quickly. So we're very targeted in who we work with because we just don't have the time or resources to waste money or time. And it's something that we really focus on the grassroots. I told Jeremy from the beginning, what we do, like 95% of it is just not sexy. It's being on the ground, being in the trenches, working with the kids, working in 100-degree heat, no air conditioning, and just clawing for everything that we can get from our sponsors, from our supporters, from our donors to make these kids' dreams come true and make them possible. It's just really grassroots level. And then once we get them, once we detect them, find them, know that they can possibly go to the next level, then a lot of times we partner with other organizations like the UCI, World Cycling Center in South Africa. That's where a lot of our kids go to start.
So, Jeremy, just to ask you, as we just expand on this a little bit, if we took a snapshot of a day in the life of Team Africa Rising, what would it be?
Oh, it's across the board. I mean, if I think of the last 5 days, I've been in the Continental Championships, right? We're the guys, and one of our friends again. So the way Kim described it is we are light in terms of staff, right? That's the way it works. We have a lot of people who work with us because they're good people. So the event we're at here in Belgium, a guy called Jamie Bissell will be arriving in about an hour. Incredible mechanics, work for Team USA, Team Canada, World Tour teams. He's got the bug as well. So he's been training mechanics all over Africa every time he goes to race. He and I fight with each other over how much excess luggage we get through. But the Worlds, I had 96 kilos when I was allowed 40. He had 120. I don't even know how he carried 120. He's quite a skinny New Zealander. It'll be things like I was interviewing David Lapatien about the future of African cycling, the World Champs 3 months ago. A week ago, I was handing out hydration tablets to riders from Somalia because there was a rider from Somalia last week with no federation, no mechanic, no bidons, literally nothing. He was just stood in his kit with a bike with 2 bottles. I asked the guy from Burundi, what's in his bottles? And the woman he had with him said, we stole some sugar sachets from hotels over there and put sugar sachets in his bottles. So I emptied his bottles out in front of him, put in a bunch of Precision hydration that we've been kindly given by Precision. And he had proper, 150 hydration tabs. It was 34 degrees at that point, with a race starting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A lot of I call it sort of advocacy and lobbying sometimes as well. Kim mentioned the UCI. Like, the UCI is an institution. It's incredible, but it's an institution. So if you sort of think of the gap between the big institution and then the federations themselves, we kind of exist in that space without any rules and regulations apart from the ones we have to comply with in the races. I might have a rider coming to me saying, how do I improve my pro cycling stats bio? Because that's how I'm going to get noticed. And I'll be there taking, I took something like 50 headshots in the Africa Champs. Even South African riders that are on Conti teams or decent teams in South Africa haven't got a PCS bio photo, haven't got their Strava on there, haven't got all these things. It's hard to describe a sort of average day because it literally is soup to nuts. I mean, even this morning, I was talking to 3 Eritrean riders who are trying to get contracts. With the continental level, we can not act as agents, but we can basically do agent type work. We won't in the higher ends. There's an Ethiopian lady that was incredible at the World Champs. She's about to join a World Tour development team. I had to call Biniam Gamai's agent, who negotiated the €4 million contract he's on, saying there's an 18-year-old in Ethiopia who needs an agent. She speaks Tigrinya. Biniam speaks Tigrinya. Can we work something out? And he was like, yep, fine. 2 days later, her Instagram has, for all discussions around media or contact Alice Carrera, the most famous agent in pro cycling, right? So we do a very broad range of things.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue into the next question. And I think this one's for you, Kim. How does it position you as an organization to work in partnership with the UCI Development Satellite in PAL, South Africa, and other talent development programs?
They're critical because we can only do so much because of budget, because of other obstacles. We can find the riders, we can identify them, but then they need to go where they're going to get more formal training because we don't do the work like we did in Rwanda anymore. We're not doing another Rwanda where we basically, supported the entire team and raised all the money for the team. We don't do that anymore. So our goal is to find these riders. And then I called up JP Van Zyl. It happened with a Ugandan kid. I called up JP and I said, listen, I've got this girl. She needs a chance. I think she's legit. Can you take her? So they added her. So a lot of the girls that were at the recent 2025 project with the UCI in France this summer were riders that we had found along the way, whether it was Uganda, Benin, Rwanda. So that's really what we do. And they're critical. And if they can get to South Africa and get on their radar, then maybe they get selected for a program like what happened in France. I don't know if it's going to look like that because, world championships happen and they move on to other countries. But then hopefully they go up to the UCI in Switzerland. That was Biniam's trajectory. That was, a lot of riders' trajectory is that they get that, initial exposure in South Africa, hopefully make it to Switzerland, or They go on to a team, they get noticed at a race, and, they go on to a team like Team Bike Aid in Germany that takes a lot of African cyclists. Because it's really hard to take a young African rider from grassroots national level, which is significantly lower than what is happening in Europe, and then try to get them all the way to a development or even a pro team. It's just near impossible. Culturally, experientially, it's just challenging. We're like the first rung, UCI South Africa, UCI Switzerland, so on and so forth.
Would you say, as a well-developed country within the continent, African continent, would you say the Performance Center in South Africa and in the Western Cape is a gateway for some of these riders to prepare themselves and get themselves to Europe in terms of preventing a culture shock?
100%. 100%.
I'd say it's the gateway. I wouldn't even say it's a gateway. I think it's the gateway. Just to add to what Kim said, the thing that we do is the UCI, because it's the institution, it has to relate to the federations. And the problem with that for them, and not us, which is quite nice, is they can't really go outside of that. So, for example, if I say and we know the UCI goes incredibly well, they trust us, right? We've been around 20 years. But if I say to them, there's an amazing mechanic in, say, Nigeria, he should come to your mechanics course. You sort of plug that into the UCI computer, and the UCI computer says, the Nigerian Cycling Federation has to put this guy's name in the system. It's really hard. So what happens, unfortunately, I won't say corruption, but there is a word. Some of the guys that get to go to South Africa may not be as good as their CV says or their federation says, but there's not much that group can do. So that's where we come in sort of on the side, in that we'll get, and as Kim said, like, we'll get a little bit of a stress test. JP or someone at the center or someone in Switzerland might call, oh, we've heard about this kid. What do you think? And we'll give an opinion. A good example of that, and I won't say the country live. Now, I was talking to a rider at the Africa Champs, who's actually at the World Champs as well, who was basically declared themselves as the national champion of their country and has gone to the center for training in recent years. And that country hasn't had a national championships in 3 or 4 years. That guy happens to be the son of the president of the federation of that country. So he might be a great cyclist, right? It could be a massive coincidence, and that's wonderful. But I think we exist in this place where we can also say, look, and I don't think in 18, 19 years we've ever said this rider's good and they're not good. So we've built up trust, I think, with UCI Switzerland and with South Africa.
If we go back to World Championships a few months ago, what would you say, having the UCI Road World Championships in Kigali, what do you think it means to Africa as a continent and to its riders? And what do you think will define its legacy in 5 or 10 years?
Having the World Championships in Africa essentially put the rubber stamp on the legitimacy of what we've been doing for the last 16, 19 years. It was a good showcase for Rwanda, and obviously they did a fantastic job, which we always believed that they would do a fantastic job. But it's mostly seeing these kids for the first time get to go to a World Championships. It's really hard to get a kid to Australia or get a kid to Norway or even America. We took some riders in 2015 to Richmond, and they were at home. They owned it. They felt it. It's that unmistakable feeling that, for instance, Jeremy had talked about seeing in 2015, seeing Daniel Tekelhamana take the King of the Mountain jersey when we were in Rwanda. It's representation. At that second that Daniel got in that KOM jersey, every single one of those Rwandan riders, all huddled around my computer watching this, knew that they could do it. They knew, because they knew where Daniel came from. They raced against Daniel. Daniel's one of them. From that point, we got a huge bump. We got a bump in more kids riding, more kids being successful, more kids going to the pro ranks. We got another bump like that when Biniam in 2024 won the stage, ended up winning 3 stages, got the points jersey. That was another bump. And then the World Championships is, of course, another bump for the continent. And I think too, and I hope that it showed federations what can be done if they really focus on the athlete as opposed to focusing on whatever they gain personally out of being in the federation. That's what I hope. That's what we strive for, is making it about the athlete.
I think the legacy question is an interesting one. Because there's only been a few riders in the headlines from Africa the last 5, 10. I mean, we had Dimension Data, right? That was a wonderful thing up till about 2020. Then you had Biniam, you've had Kim LaCourt, you've had Ashley Moorman-Pasio, a few others. A lot of people talk about the world champs in Rwanda as sort of like this big moment for African cycling. And I sort of describe it as like chapter 4 or 5 in the story. If I look at 2025, just to give you a data point, there are 141 Africans in the World Tour Pro Conti and Conti level teams, right? 141. Now, the USA in 2025 had less than 80. This isn't kind of I keep hearing people talking about the Rwanda World Champs being the beginning of something or the start of something, which requires this word legacy. But in reality, it was kind of this sort of big tick to say, actually, because we've had 15 years of African riders in the pro peloton, we've had stage winners. Daryl Impey was wearing the yellow jersey back in 2013, right? So this isn't new. And there's been a little bit too much of this narrative recently of like new. And I'm like, no, African cycling's been on the world stage for 15 years now, right? Ever since MTN Quebec kicked off really in like 2020, 2010, 2011. The Rwanda World Champs, the legacy of it is, as Kim said, it's a big tick for the continent to say, actually, this is possible. But I have to say, having been on the ground, what I noticed is a lot of people from Europe, Asia, and to some extent the US have got a lot of stereotypes about Africa. A little bit Rwanda specifically, but a lot of it's just Africa. And I think what happened is they turned up in a very modern city, incredibly clean, far cleaner than where I live in London. And it was safe, it was fine, the food was great, everything was great, the fans were great. And it just had that tick of going, this isn't the wilds. This is a modern, vibrant, clean, safe city. And I think that's the actual legacy of it, is it just put a stamp down to say, yeah, if you wanted to do another one here, or in anywhere in some of the major countries in Africa, it'll be fine. You could do it in South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, without any major problems. And I think that is actually the true legacy. It wasn't really about African cycling or cyclists in that sense. It was more about Africa as a continent being part of the cycling world.
What are the challenges you still face? And how do you balance the cultural and political forces that pull against you?
I think for us, visas continue to be an issue. It's challenging moving African cyclists around. It doesn't get easier. I was really fortunate recently because I brought the Benin women to the Maryland Cycling Classic. We have a really good relationship with the U.S. Embassy in Cotonou. It just takes a lot of relationship building and trust. And so we were able to secure visas, but it's still probably high on the list. Culturally, we're taking them from a culture that's very grounded in family and a really huge support network. It's just completely different. Then we plunk them down in Europe or America or even Asia, and it's night and day. And even though, like Jeremy said, Kigali is this really modern city, most people don't live in Kigali. They live rural. It's taking rural kids, rural village kids, and dropping them in a place like Belgium. And it was funny. I remember one time talking to Carol Austin, who used to work for Dimension Data. She was the doctor, and she's like, they don't do well in the cold. Like, they just really don't. They develop really thick hair, and they're freezing. So, we learned, don't send Africans to Belgium in March. It's just not good. And there's that, obviously, support. Federations carry a lot of weight in Africa, so sometimes it makes your job really challenging because there is corruption. We don't pay bribes. We're not going to pay a bribe, but unfortunately, sometimes that means a federation president's kid gets in versus an actual athlete. Those things happen. We try to mitigate them the best we can. To Jeremy's point as well, there's still 140 African riders somewhere in the pro level in cycling. That's huge. And it's only going to grow because the representation's there. It's been done. It's not new. It's just incremental growth.
There was a moment about 3 years ago where Kim and I and a few others were talking, saying the gap between kind of the top African groups and some of the Europeans was the closest it had been in a while. So we were all quite excited. And then suddenly the technology just suddenly jumped again. We were like, oh no. And it was actually related to the virtual world as well. Like we would, I think it was Masaka or one of the groups we were working with, were trying to qualify for the E-World Championships. And everything was great and they were doing great and they're absolutely up there and should have qualified. And then I think there was a rule that said they have to have 2 power data supplies. And the guy from Zwift or someone like that said, oh, could you just get some power pedals for that rider in rural Uganda? And that was the end of that situation. You realize things like Whoop and stuff like that. You had all these movements in nutrition and things like that change. And that it's those moments where the gap moves again. As I said last week at the Africa Champs, like we were the only people handing out electrolytes because you can't buy electrolytes probably outside of maybe South Africa, Kenya, and a few places. So there are moments like that do keep the gaps. So like the one thing that it's my biggest takeaway from the World Championships, there are only a few ex-pro riders, African pro riders that raced either Conti, pro Conti level in Europe, coaching in Africa. And that's actually the problem, is that you've got federations that are just about good enough to get riders to sort of a decent national level, but they don't know what racing pro really is. So Kim mentioned, Adrian works with Benin. That's a game changer for Benin. They've gone from 20 in Africa to number 9. Daniel Tekla is now the U23 coach for Eritrea. That's going to have a huge impact. And those guys have got 20 odd riders now racing pro. But when you look across the 54 federations of Africa, you've got 18 national champs. That's it, of 54 federations. So even the most basic thing a federation should do is not happening. The thing I've now said to a few people, and it ruffled some feathers in Kenya, but I said, if your president of cycling has no idea what cycling is, it's not great, but that's a sort of management job, so maybe that's okay. But if they are that person, then the technical director or the head coach has to be someone from cycling. It has to be one of the two. It cannot be not either. And even when I talk to the Rwanda guys, like the president of Rwanda cycling is a swimmer. You can just tell, cycling's such a complicated sport. You can just tell that a swimmer's never really going to get it. And so that's one of our challenges, is trying to convince, even from South Africa, right? If you look at, Aaron, you've got a bunch of South African pros. Reinhardt's probably going to retire this year. I'd love to see someone like Reinhardt Janssen van Rensburg become the beast, become a coach, right? And send him off to Uganda or somewhere for a year or so. That's the thing that's missing, is that sort of knowledge of what is a pro cyclist, because a lot of those federations really they don't know.
You mentioned the influence of virtual cycling there. You kind of alluded to it a little bit. And that's, the reason why we had you on the podcast today. We had Ross Burridge from Masaka a while ago, and I think that he used the exact same words that you used. Virtual cycling democratizes cycling for young riders in Africa, right? It really does. It levels those barriers. To begin a much more focused talk about this initiative that you've started, I want to ask you a very broad-based question. Would you be as far as you are if smart trainers weren't invented, or if there were no such thing as virtual cycling platforms?
I don't think so. And I say that with a caveat, though, because we moved to the virtual platform because of COVID. We had a grant from the Walton Foundation. We couldn't do anything on our grant because it required travel. It required being in these countries doing the work. That's how the grant was written. And we stepped back and rewrote the entire grant during COVID and said, we have an idea to keep this going. That's how the virtual system initially started. We put the first 20 trainers into Benin. We sent trainers to Rwanda. It kept kids on the bike. Places like Rwanda were completely shut down. You had to have a pass to go anywhere. So it really kept kids motivated. And I don't know, it's hard to say in hindsight, but I know it saved us and kept us going. When we were at a crossroads, we looked to Masaka Cycling Club because they had it dialed in, and we showed the president of Benin. I took a trainer to Benin in January 2021 when I could travel, and we started testing kids. And for us, possibly it could have moved faster if we had had them, because of the simple fact is we don't have enough bikes. We've never had enough bikes. We've never had enough equipment. We never have the right shoes, the right size. It's always a challenge. And we can put a kid on a trainer, and we can tell pretty quickly whether they at least have the possibility. Then we can move them to the road. We can move them to a bike. I remember one time in Rwanda, I had this guy and everybody kept saying how great he was. And he was a young kid and he wrecked 2 bikes in 2 days. And I'm just like, I'm out. Love you. I believe you probably have some talent, but I can't afford any more bikes. And so I think what it's done is it's given us a more consistent way to identify talent. We're able to take it all over the country as opposed to having it only in one place. Benin now has over 50 trainers, smart trainers in the country, and we have them in every state in Benin, every district in Benin. So then we train coaches. We've been able to train coaches more efficiently. It's really significant. It's just moved it quicker than we were able to move in the past.
I think it's the leverage, isn't it? Like it's to get 10, 11 or 12 speed carbon road bikes into a country. You're already saying, okay, that's $30,000-$40,000 someone's got to find. As Kim says, if a kid crashes one of those bikes, snaps that frame, it's game over. So the leverage of e-trainers has been incredible. So, I mean, when I first went to Rwanda, they had the Velotron, I think it's called. It's this like 30-year-old powered bike thing that these guys had 50 kids a day going through. Like it was just constant. All you could hear was whirring in that camp. It was just a line of kids down the road, like just going in there, doing their power and checking. And I think it's the leverage of that is that you don't have to have a coach in a car, with a bunch of 16-year-olds riding bikes, and the coach is shouting at them from a car, hoping it's gonna be okay. And when I've seen some of the videos from Benin and especially Uganda, actually with Masaka, where you've got 6 women lined up racing, doing a team time trial or training for a time trial, and the coach is just walking around, adjusting positions, talking about cadence, talking about power, looking over their shoulder, then getting all the power out of Zwift Power or Training Peaks. You look at that and go, that's what they need, is that absolute basics of coaching. I was getting cadence training when I was 6, when I was racing BMXs. It's just not something that happens in a lot of places across the continent. And I think just by the complexity of Zwift, even I was showing a guy from Guinea at Africa Champs, like Zwift on my iPhone, and just showing him the workout section and how like 60-minute, 30-minute power sprints, hill climbs. And this kid was like, I don't need a coach, for this. That would improve me in the next 6 months, and then I can get a coach. And I think that's the big thing, is that it's allowing us to leverage out, one center and I'm talking to Namibia at the moment. They're going to put one center in the north, one in the south. They reckon they could put 200 kids through that within 2 or 3 months of opening. That's the game changer part. But I don't know whether it's replacing anything. It's just, as Kim said, it's sort of augmenting something. But then the leverage is the key thing for us, because it means we don't have to get the bikes. You have 20 pairs of shoes, 10 heart rate monitors, six hubs, and you're done.
In your estimation, what percentage of the riders who competed for African nations at the recent World Championships and then recently the African Continental Championships are or were Zwift users, apart from South Africa? Because I know some of those guys personally, and a lot of them are on Zwift and racing some of my teams, but apart from South Africa.
That's 100% for Benin. They've all been on trainers, every one of them.
Yeah, same for Uganda. The Rwandan women, like not the men, not so much, but some of the women. I mean, some of it we're getting into, like Algeria, for example. Like they've got 20, I think, trainers on their way. They are looking forward to it because they know it's the thing that's missing for them. The reason for them, very simply, is it's women, and riding a bike in Algeria is still a bit tricky, and not having to wear head to toe covering. Lycra is still a big cultural change there, which is happening, and it has happened to some extent. But just the safety of it being in a Zwift hub. There's outposts, but I don't think it's more than probably 50% of everyone at the Africa Champs this year. Probably no more than 50% would be on Zwift yet. But I think Africa Champs next year, if it's probably October time, I spoke to probably 15 countries at the Champs, and every single one of them was like, we need Zwift or we need e-training.
Quite interesting, because I always monitoring the rankings on Zwift, particularly the African nations. And apart from South Africa and Namibia, it's only Uganda that is actually pushing through. And it makes sense that only 50% of the nations are using that. And obviously the infrastructure with Masaka, they've got a good thing going there.
Yeah, I mean, they're what, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years that they've been, I think they're top 30 now in the world in e-racing. Again, a bit like what we did with Rwanda, right? It took 10 years to get Rwanda from nowhere to top 2 or 3 in the whole of Africa. I think we can do that on esports with these countries very quickly. I mean, talking to the Zambia guys and the Namibia guys, the Zambia guys, they're going to get their mountain, but they want to hit the mountain bike Olympic in the US in 2028, mountain bike world champs next year. They're going to put their mountain bikers through this project with us, because they realize that they need the power training and the cadence training.
I guess this brings us to the initiative you call the Virtual Performance Center program. Can you share the inspiration for the program and tell us about it, please?
Yeah, I mean, it literally is the virtual version of what Africa Rising did originally. So where we ran and created the Rwandan national team and then sort of used that as a model to develop other nations, we looked at what Masaka Cycling had done in Uganda. They launched on the virtual platform, I think in 2019 or maybe early 2020. And we've worked with them quite closely. We've upgraded their systems. We've got them heart rate monitors and things like this. And we sat down and realized that we could do that in other places. So we did a deal with Wahoo and we shipped a load of trainers, as Kim mentioned, into Benin. And then a sort of magic moment happened at the start of 2025. If you remember back during COVID, Zwift started making their own e-hubs, sort of in competition with Wahoo. That got dealt with. I won't talk about what happened, but that got dealt with. And then Zwift came to us and said, look, we've got the warranty deadline for those hubs, and the hubs they sold runs out in early 2025. And they've got around about 350 hubs in the US, Europe, and the UK, which obviously they can't sell due to the agreement with Wahoo. And if you can't sell an e-hub, there's not much you can do with it. And these are obviously brand new e-hubs, right? There's not much you can do with it apart from scrap them. And they're a good company, so they really didn't want to scrap them or have anything even close to that. So they came to us and said, look, we've worked with you guys before on various things. Like, do you think you could take them? And I think we're on the same call. Kim and I are on the same call. We said yes faster than each of us could say yes. And then we've spent quite a lot of time throughout 2025 working out where to put them, where to store them, who should have them. A bit like we discussed earlier, that because we're not an institution like UCR or folks like that, we can decide what we do and really qualify. So we've sat down and looked at countries and said, okay, we know a really good rider, or we know a really good club. They may not be endorsed by their federation. They may even be kept at arm's length by their federation, but that's where these things should go. So over 2025, before we made the announcement of the project, officially, we've been talking to around a dozen countries to basically really do our due diligence to see if they've got the right Wi-Fi, the right center, the right safety. And then everyone started to say, this is something we want to be involved with. So it started off, as I said, an inspiration by Masaka, but then within a year or two, we had trainers in Rwanda, in Uganda, more trainers in Uganda, Benin. They're going to be in Algeria this year, or early next year. They're going to be in Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, and Namibia, and various other countries. It is snowballing because they've seen how Masaka became sort of a nice brand, but also they were getting riders into the pro peloton because one of their female riders joined the Canyon SRAM team last year, and she's probably mainly trained on Zwift and in Uganda. Had never really raced UCI and managed to get a contract. And that is a key moment for us because we can show federations that literally have no idea what e-training, virtual racing is. We can show them something they understand, which is a contract with a pro team, in the top 3 levels of cycling. And I think that's the moment people have really started to say, actually, this is a thing, because that's what they understand is the pro cycling part. What we know will happen is once they adopt it, their pipeline is going to be 10 times the size it probably ever was.
Now, do you see that evolving into the development of a future for cycling esports, the potential for an African racing series, the potential debut of the virtual Africa Rising Continental Road Cycling Championships?
I'm glad you said that. We were just laughing because that's exactly what we want to do. And we have some challenges on the continent. Internet is challenging. Luckily, there's satellite available in a lot of places. It was a game changer for Benin. We were able to get a satellite hookup, which made all the difference in the world. As we alluded to earlier, some of the challenges facing African riders are stuff that riders in first world countries in the Western world don't even think of. Am I going to have stable internet, or is it going to bounce me off in the middle of a race? We really want to create a Africa Rising series. We want to make it adaptable for wherever anybody is, because we already laughed about the fact that we can't provide a double method of power for these African athletes just because the cost is too much. I can't drop $1,000 on power pedals for every rider racing across the continent. So we take into consideration some of those issues, and to develop our own race series whereby maybe we can funnel 10, 15, 20 riders up through the system and get them the backup power, meters that they need, then great. We have to own it on the African continent. We have to develop our own series. We can't wait for other people to do it for us. It's challenging to enter some of these races, like I said, just for various reasons around connectivity and equipment, but we can develop it for Africa. And that's really where we're at now, is putting together that for 2026.
Do you think somewhere on the continent there's a little boy and girl walking around that could be the future Tour de France winner, right? And do you think the Virtual Performance Center program is the talent identification program that's going to bring them to the fore?
I think it's always hard to ask a question like that because we're quite humble in what we do. So it's hard to say, yes, we're going to create it. I mean, it's got to help, right? One of the challenges we always talk about is that kids are getting on bikes in Africa roughly around 13, 14, 15. I first raced a BMX when I was 4. There's that 10-year period that Westerners generally have got in terms of learning skills and stuff like that. The amount of kids in Americas, Europe, Asia riding mountain bikes when they're 8, 9, 10, giving you all the core skills that you need to be a good road cyclist. That's what the virtual platform is, I think, going to give. You can put 12, 13-year-olds on this, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds on it, because you can adjust the saddle about 1.5 foot, much more you can on a road bike. I have the Zwift ride system. I can raise my bars almost a foot. That's just not possible on a real bike. So I think 100% it's gonna move the dial. The challenge for us is making sure that the coaches around it are the coaches that can help those riders use it. And that's why, as I said before, we diligence hugely where we put these trainers rather than just saying, let's give 50 trainers to X federation. That's just not our style. And we've got the scars to prove that that's not probably the way to do it. But I think those people are already coming as well. Like there's the Ethiopian rider, 18 years old, will be announced day after tomorrow on a World Tour development team. That woman's never been on Zwift. Her coach 3 days ago was saying to me, how do I get 30 trainers into Ethiopia? She will race the Tour de France Femme, I think, probably in 3 years. She'll be using Zwift within the next 3 or 4 months for sure, because her team will put her on Zwift. Ethiopian cycling's looking at this as a thing, saying, actually, we've got her, which is a huge moment. And she's technically a year ahead of Biniam Gamay in terms of her achievements at her age. But her federation's looking at it going, actually, we can't afford to buy 50 bikes for 50 kids. But if we can get 30 trainers from you guys, the Zwift licenses, because Zwift are incredibly generous and give us free subscriptions for each of these riders, that's saving them hundreds of thousands of dollars on equipment. It's surely going to create some new talent. I just think we're the people to take credit for it at this point.
Well, I have to say one thing. Great story. How it can find a kid. In 2021, I was in Benin for the first time with my smart trainer, showing everybody. And in walks this statuesque, amazing young woman named Melvina. I think she was 14 at the time. I don't speak French. She doesn't speak English. I point to the bike that's hooked to a smart trainer. She gets on the bike. She's in flip-flops. I set up a quick account for her and she starts riding. And I'm like, how long is she going to go? And I think that was when you could have like a week free on Zwift. And she just kept riding. She was at the World Championships. She was also at the African Continental Championships. She's now a junior. She's been to the UCI in South Africa. And this young woman just showed up in my house and rode a bike on Zwift. And that's where it started. And I found her and she's amazing. And I think she's got real talent.
Yeah, it's a great story about that accessibility and you being the conduits to that. We're going to conclude with just one more question. But before we do, for anyone who's listening, who's inspired and wants to help, what's the best way they can get involved or support Team Africa Rising?
We have a fabulous website, teamafricarising.org. And we have a very large social media network as well, LinkedIn, Instagram. You can find all of that via our website. We have a whole special section about the virtual performance centers as well. You can donate online. We take donations around the world. So it's super easy. We're always looking for support. And, even in-kind support. I had somebody the other day say, I have a Pinarello. I'm in Florida. Can I ship it to you in Wyoming, which is my home base? They're shipping it to Wyoming, and that bike will end up probably in Rwanda before we're done. Things like that happen all the time. But honestly, we're fortunate in getting the smart trainers from Zwift and getting memberships, but we still need support to run these camps, to feed these kids, to give them opportunities, to send them to places like South Africa.
It's really great. Here on the Virtual Velo Podcast, we like to conclude with a big picture question. And since I have you both here, I'll put it out there for each to share your insights. If you could leave our audience with one message about the power of bike in an underserved country or the mission of Team Africa Rising, what would it be?
Wow.
I think what I'd say is everyone I've met around the world everyone remembers their first bike. It's a complete global phenomenon. No one remembers their first iPad, but they remember their first bike. And I think what we're doing, with the World Champs help with this a little bit, is it shows Africa's got the ability to become a huge cycling continent and force in the sport. And I said to David Lapatien in February, we have to start saying cycling can be the second sport of Africa. Soccer's always the dominant sport in virtually every nation, but cycling has the ability to become the second sport of Africa. And I think that's what we've been doing for 20 years in real life, and now 3 or 4 years virtually. And I think that's where you're going to see the growth. And I think that, to me, is the big thing, is it's bringing the bike into the sports world for Africa, which is something that may not have been as big as it now is coming.
I'm sitting here because I don't think I can get through this question without crying. It's what I've done since 2009 to land in Rwanda. And the bike, for a lot of people in the Western world, convenience, fun, maybe I race, maybe I get a scholarship to a cycling college. But for these African kids, it's their whole future. And whether they ever make it to the pro ranks or not, they become a mechanic. They become a coach. They become a soigneur. They are involved in administrative duties around cycling. There's so many opportunities. And I think about our very first rider in Rwanda was a young man named Rafiki Uimana. He wasn't the best. He was never going to go pro. Today, he is at the UCI doing his level 3 mechanics course. He provides for his family. He's got 4 kids, a wife, and he provides for his family through the sport of cycling. He's got his own touring business in Rwanda, and his son is a phenomenal junior with a Biniam Gourmet kind of kick in him. That's what it's about. It's these futures that we can't even imagine that are possible because of the bike. And it might mean that they never make it to the pro ranks, but they end up like Rafiki Uimana, who takes care of his family because of the bike.
I think that's a great last word, and we'll stay with that. You can subscribe to the Virtual Velo Podcast on your favorite podcast provider and YouTube. You can follow Emma Martin on Instagram at biking_Emma and Chris, me, at the Zmunik. You can catch Emma putting words to the action this weekend on the My Wish Sunday Race Club. Head over to thezmunik.com and please become a member of the Escape Collective to join the conversation and support independent cycling esports journalism. And also check out Aaron Burrill's work on Cycling Weekly in his new role as tech editor. Good luck, my friend. We will have some more interesting guests from the world of cycling esports joining us soon. Next up is 3-time world champion Jason Osborne. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you to Jeremy Ford and Kimberly Coates of Team Africa Rising for joining us, and to you for listening. And at this Thanksgiving time, I will remind you to please take care of your heart. Get a coronary artery calcium scan. This is the part where I cry, Kimberly, so get ready. I'm thankful that simple test saved my life, and it could save yours. Ride safely. Goodbye.